Hello and welcome. Thank you for taking the time to watch our presentation today on Pandemic, Emissary Pandas in the Middle East. We also would like to thank Virus Bulletin and all of those involved in putting together the Virus Bulletin localhost event.
Hi, my name is Jacomo. I'm the team lead for outreach at Team Cymru. I'm responsible for the engagement with communities and also to sign up for our community services.
And I'm James Shank, Senior Security Evangelist and Chief Architect of Community Services for Team Cymru. Today we're going to be talking about several different things. We'll talk about the Emissary Pandas and their activity in the Middle East. We'll talk about the attacker infrastructure. We'll talk about Twitter and its use for geopolitical messaging in the modern era and the impact of that messaging on APT activity. And we'll talk about Persian defensive tools. Another way to characterize what we're talking about today is scouting. Scouting is a well-known military tactic that's been in use for many, many years. But this isn't sufficient. What we'd like to talk about today is cyber field awareness. Cyber field awareness is similar to battlefield awareness. It goes above and beyond yesterday's threat intelligence to enable defenders a more capable and directed response towards attacker methodologies. Our story today begins in summer of 2019. In June of 2019, AE-CERT publishes an advisory that has a really long English name. This advisory includes 18 IP addresses that are positive IOCs for the APT27 actor infrastructure. It characterizes some of the communication techniques that the actors are using, including use of TCP port 443 for communications from the victim computers to the actor controllers, and TCP port 4550 connecting from the higher order infrastructure into the controllers and other parts of the infrastructure. They also reveal within this report a new tool called HyperSSL. HyperSSL appears to us to be a HyperPro variant. HyperPro is a family of malware that has been in use by the APT27 actors for quite some time. In our research into this particular strain, we did find a reference in a FireEye paper where they labeled it Focus Fjord. So just for awareness, there might be some other names by which this tool is referred. Starting with the AE-CERT paper, we take the IOCs out of that paper and dive into our data sets to look to see what we can do to enrich the data. We quickly notice that there's an X509 certificate that's hosted by several of the hosts that are identified by the AE-CERT paper. This X509 certificate has a particular issuer and subject line that is a little bit unique and is useful to us later, but we'll get into that. This certificate allows us to identify other actor-controlled infrastructure presenting the exact same X509 certificate. We also look into the network metadata associated with these hosts, and we notice the TCP 4550 that AE-CERT mentioned being used, but we also see TCP port 22, commonly used for SSH, and we believe this is used for managing the controllers. We see TCP port 443 in use as well, and UDP port 443. As I mentioned, we started with the indicators published in the AE-CERT paper, and in our initial round of looking into further hosts, we immediately identified 15 more related hosts that are part of the APT27 actor infrastructure, matching several different fingerprints. And at the time that we did our investigation into our data sets, several of the hosts that AE-CERT had talked about were no longer online. This suggests or begins to suggest to us that there may be some dynamic use of hosts within the APT27 actor behavior. With our growing understanding of the APT27 network activity, we're able to diagram what the APT27 infrastructure looked like from our perspective in the summer of 2019. But we'll come back to this in just a moment. At this point, we're starting to understand some of the communication patterns that are used by the APT27 actor group. We see a lot of victim connections from the Middle East in particular connecting to TCP port 443 of the controllers. We also see hosts from Hong Kong and China connecting via TCP port 4550 into the controllers. We see SSH connections between several hosts, particularly from some of the endpoint hosts into the controllers. We also see what appears to us to be VPN-like connections from Hong Kong hosts into the controllers. With the network fingerprints that we've been discussing, we're able to look through our data holdings to find communications patterns that match these fingerprints. Here we're showing an example of NetFlow data showing victims connecting via TCP port 443 to the command and control servers used by APT's 27 actors. These are just a few examples, but even within this set, you can see victims within the UAE, which is consistent with some of the victimology that's mentioned by AE-CERT's white paper. Going back to our summer 2019 diagram, there's a few nodes on here that I would like to call attention to. The red arrow here points to what we believe to be an operational node. This node we believe to be used as an exit point at the end of the VPN tunnel set up by the actor. This node is hosted at DigitalOcean. Its IP address is 139.59.67.212. This node was observed hosting the X509 certificate identified between April and June of 2019. We see connections into this host that appear to be VPN connections, and connections out from this host that appear to be SSH connections. We also see traffic that would be compatible with possible recon activity. And we believe that this host is used primarily for management and forward compromise activities. The gold arrow is pointing to one of the VPN nodes. This is used as a middle VPN relay. This node hosted the X509 certificate from April to July of 2019. This host receives most of the connections from ChinaNet backbone hosts. Again, these connections are believed to be VPN connections. This connects out to Alibaba and DigitalOcean hosts, mostly with VPN connections. The row of blue hosts below the red arrow are controllers. These hosts are observed receiving connections from believed victims. The row of red hosts are hosted at Alibaba, and we believe that these may be used to bring data back from the controllers. The ChinaNet host in the bottom right, we believe may be closest to the actors. But at this point, we're still building our understanding. In diving into our datasets looking for other associated behavior, we notice that there's another X509 certificate that has a matching issuer and subject line to the original X509 certificate. This certificate also has a not before date that is within a few minutes of the same time of day, on a different day, but same time of day, of the first X509 certificate that we observed. We start to monitor the hosts that are serving this, and we see multiple fingerprints overlapping with actor behavior, and with high confidence we can assert that this certificate is also part of the APT27 actor infrastructure. This certificate was observed at the same time as we still saw activity on the first X509 certificate, so there was an overlapping duration of the use of the two X509 certificates. We also see TCP port 4550 traffic declining during this period, but we see the introduction of a new port 55781, again on TCP, that is in use by the actors at this time. In September of 2019, we start to have a more developed understanding of the actor infrastructure. The flow of traffic appears to be moving from the actor through VPN connections at hosting providers to an operational node, management node, and then from there connecting into the controllers for management purposes. This same exit point is also used for recon activity at different points. The controllers then all appear to connect to a node that we're calling a data path node. We believe that this node may be used for exfiltration of data from the controllers. The red arrow points to the same node as we mentioned before, 68.183.94.205, and it's still playing the same role as it was during summer of 2019 in September. The gold arrow points to a new node. This is a data path node. It's receiving TCP port 55781 connections from the controllers. This is also the first time that we saw DMIT cloud services of Hong Kong being used for hosting any of the infrastructure. Also, we noticed that there was an introduction of Linode as one of the hosting providers for both controllers and some of the nodes hosting the X509 certificate. In September, we only see 3 nodes still hosting the first identified X509 certificate, but now we see 10 nodes hosting the second identified X509 certificate. By November of 2019, we're confident that TCP port 4550 is no longer in use by the actors. It's been quite some time since we've seen this port used in connections associated with the APT27 infrastructure. Much of the infrastructure remains largely the same between September and November of 2019, but we do see a migration of hosts that were previously at DigitalOcean now moving to Linode. We see the introduction of a new node from ChinaNet Backbone that is hosting the second X509 certificate. This is the first time that we've observed ChinaNet Backbone hosting any of the X509 certificates. We also identify a DigitalOcean host that's receiving TCP 8080 connections from a host that is hosting the X509 certificate, but at this point we aren't sure what the use of this host is. As we move into December, we see some significant changes. As a note, the red arrow and the gold arrow on this slide point to the same nodes that we've been referring to in the past few slides. We see a shift in the total number of nodes hosted at Linode versus DigitalOcean, where DigitalOcean seems to be falling out of favor in use during December, and Linode is increasing in the number of hosts that are used in part of the APT27 infrastructure. We had previously noted the significance of the red arrowed host. This host is now having some of its functions performed by 2 new hosts that appear on Linode's network. Around this time, we began to wonder whether the actors were making a complete shift away from DigitalOcean in favor of Linode. We did note as well that the overall network increased in size. We also note here that there was an increase overall in the number of victim connections. We previously were not showing victim connections, but because of the significant changes, we introduced that on this slide. On the topic of victims, we see a peculiar system incorporated into the APT27 actor infrastructure this month. The system shown in the lower left in yellow is a system at a Canadian elder care facility or nursing home. We suspect this node was compromised, yet this is the first time that we've observed a compromised system being used in this way. This node may not have been part of the infrastructure for very long, but during the time that it was online, we did see some reconnaissance-like activity originating from this node.
December 15 of 2019 brings an interesting change to our story. On this day, we see the Iranian Minister of Communication and Information Technology tweeting that several of their servers have been compromised by a spy malware that they believe it's linked to APT27 actors. Diving back into our data and looking for indicators for malware that we previously have linked to activities by the APT27 group, we notice a sample of malware holdings that had a shared mutex pattern that was known to be associated with the APT27 tools. But this sample looked odd to us, as it didn't match several of other signatures. So we dive and look at it. The file details of this malware show it was called AFTA APT27 removal.exe. AFTA is an Iranian agency organized under the Supreme National Security Council and responsible in part for secure Iranian assets. In our own sandbox run, we capture the image you can see on the right. On the right hand of this image, you can see the AFTA logo, and on the left side, the logo of Bitban, which is an Iranian malware analysis company. And they mentioned themselves also in late December 2019 that they worked in cooperation with AFTA to create a malware removal tool to clean up APT27. While a cooperation between a private company is not uncommon, which strikes us as interest is that this partnership was disclosed very openly And that makes you wonder how bad the situation was at the time.
Thanks for that, Giacomo. So did the kittens beat the pandas? What does the data show? Interestingly, in January and late December, we see a complete stop to all the Iranian victim traffic. It appears like the remediation tool and the efforts that Iran engaged in to clean up their assets were indeed successful. But it doesn't stop there. The APT-27 actors reduced their overall activity completely. We see a reduction in the management traffic. We see a reduction in the infrastructure. We see a reduction in the new victimology. And we see some of the nodes that they previously used shifting around. Of note, 68.183.94.205, which was previously the operational node hosted at DigitalOcean, is no longer active. This was one of the prominent and important assets in the actor infrastructure prior to January of 2020. We see a continued shift from DigitalOcean to Linode, and we see a reduction overall in victims and the totality of the victim connections. This image doesn't show the volume, but the volume is significantly down. The actors appear to not be engaging in recon activity like we've observed them in the past. All of this appears like the APT-27 actors responded to the Iranian remediation by deciding to lay low and tear down infrastructure for a little while. Moving into February of 2020, we see a continued reduction in overall activity. But we do see recon activity increasing this month. We also see new countries being introduced into the recon activity set of these actors that we had previously not observed. A host from Shank Telecom in China is observed connecting into one of our operational nodes. This is the first time we have seen this telecommunications company hosting a node connecting into this infrastructure. With the coming of spring, in March of 2020, we see new activity and expansion of our infrastructure. It had previously appeared to us that the actors were migrating away from DigitalOcean in favor of Linode. But with the introduction of new hosts at DigitalOcean in March of 2020 and the introduction of another hosting provider, G-Core Labs, that we have previously not observed, we begin to understand that it's perhaps the case that the APT-27 actors were adopting a multi-cloud strategy. Multi-cloud strategies are popular among enterprises for increasing redundancy and availability, and it might be the case that our threat actors were seeking this goal as well. On this image, you can see two black arrows pointing to the old operational nodes at Linode. These nodes were less active during this period and appear to have been retired on the 8th of March 2020. We see the introduction of two new nodes, one at Alibaba, one at DigitalOcean, that are seen connecting via SSH into the infrastructure. These are indicated by the red arrows. These nodes are 66.175.218.50 and 47.56.254.96. These hosts have become the new operational nodes at the end of March 2020. Moving into April, we see the DigitalOcean node and the Alibaba node, indicated by the red arrows, have taken on the full operational duty as the exit nodes. We also see some interesting indicators that perhaps the Iranian remediation was not entirely successful. We see a connection on TCP port 993 from some Iranian assets into one of our operational nodes. This comes at a time when the reconnaissance traffic from APT-27 to Iranian address space is also increasing. Perhaps the kittens didn't beat the pandas after all. Since the time that we submitted our paper for Virus Bulletin, we've continued to track this actor activity. They're still very much active. We did see some changes that are notable to their patterns of behavior. First, we saw the reintroduction of a host that was previously appeared to us to be retired during the turndown in December, or the reduction of activity in December. The DMIT hosting server came back to life and was in use again. We also saw TCP 55781 traffic seem to have stopped or have been reduced, and we see the introduction of a new port, TCP port 38102. This port we first observed in late April, and we note that it continues in an upward trend in usage through at least June of this year. We also observe some changes in the victim connections into controllers. Previously, we had noted that TCP port 443 was the port in protocol favored for connections into controllers. In this time period, we've started to see the introduction of UDP 53, TCP port 8080, and TCP port 8443. Perhaps most significantly, we see a change to their X509 certificate patterns of use. Previously, they were using a issuer and subject of domain.com and VPN for the common names and the certificate attributes. Now they're using common names that are prevalent services of online companies. We don't have full details as to why they made this change. In summary, the APT27 actors are not subtle. In this paper, we revealed multiple high-confidence indicators of APT27 activity, including IP addresses, X509 certificates, and details of X509 certificates, as well as several ports and communication techniques in use by the actors. We reveal that their preferred method of management activity is to create a series of VPN nodes, and at the end of that, the SSH out from those VPN nodes to manage their controllers, as well as for forward compromise activity. We also reveal certain characteristics of their victimology. We can confirm that they do target the Middle East, but they also target parts of Europe and parts of Asia. Finally, we also talk about how the kittens caught the pandas, but in the end, the pandas came back. This level of understanding about actor activity, this ability to narrate the entire story, this is cyber field awareness. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for having us. Thanks for inviting us, and thanks for watching.